Susan Brownell Anthony stands as one of the most influential figures in American history, a woman whose tireless efforts helped shape the landscape of women's rights and social justice. As a leader in the women's suffrage movement, she dedicated her life to securing equal rights for women, particularly the right to vote. At a time when society largely dismissed the idea of gender equality, Anthony's unwavering determination, strategic activism, and relentless campaigning laid the foundation for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Her life serves as an enduring testament to the power of conviction, courage, and perseverance in the face of adversity. Born into a family of reformers, Susan B. Anthony was raised with strong moral principles that emphasized equality and justice. Her Quaker upbringing instilled in her a belief in the inherent worth of all people, regardless of gender or race. These early influences played a crucial role in shaping her worldview and commitment to social reform. Unlike many women of her time, Anthony received a formal education, which equipped her with the skills and confidence to challenge societal norms. She first pursued a career in teaching, where she witnessed firsthand the inequalities women faced, including lower wages and limited career opportunities. This experience ignited her passion for advocating for women's rights. Although she initially focused on education and labor reform, Anthony soon expanded her efforts to broader issues of social justice. She became an active member of the abolitionist movement, working alongside prominent figures like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison to end slavery in the United States. Her activism in the abolitionist cause strengthened her understanding of political organization and advocacy, skills that she later applied to the fight for women's suffrage. She recognized the deep connections between the struggles of enslaved people and the oppression of women, further solidifying her belief that all people deserved equal rights. The mid-19th century was a period of intense social and political change in the United States, and Anthony emerged as a formidable force in the women's rights movement. She met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a fellow activist and reformer, in the early 1850s, and their partnership would become one of the most influential in the history of the suffrage movement. Together, they worked to organize campaigns, deliver speeches, and publish materials advocating for women's right to vote. They co-founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, in 1869, an organization dedicated to achieving voting rights for women through a federal constitutional amendment. Despite her dedication and the support of fellow activists, Anthony faced significant opposition throughout her life. The prevailing societal norms dictated that women should remain in domestic roles, and many people, both men and women, viewed her ideas as radical and even dangerous. She was frequently ridiculed in newspapers, denied speaking opportunities, and even physically threatened for her activism. However, these obstacles only fueled her resolve. She remained steadfast in her mission, believing that justice and equality were worth any personal sacrifice. One of the defining moments of Anthony's career occurred in 1872 when she was arrested for voting in the presidential election. At the time, women were prohibited from casting ballots, but Anthony defiantly exercised her right as a citizen. Her arrest and subsequent trial became a national sensation, drawing widespread attention to the suffrage movement. Although she was fined $100, she refused to pay, making a bold statement about the injustice of the system. This act of civil disobedience further cemented her reputation as a fearless leader willing to challenge oppressive laws. Anthony's contributions extended beyond her direct activism. She was also a prolific writer and speaker, delivering hundreds of speeches across the country and publishing numerous articles and books advocating for women's rights. She played a key role in compiling and preserving the history of the suffrage movement, ensuring that future generations would recognize the struggles and achievements of the women who fought for equality. Her meticulous documentation of the movement's progress became an invaluable resource for historians and activists alike. As the years passed, Anthony continued her relentless pursuit of justice. Though she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote, her influence was undeniable. She paved the way for future generations of women to participate fully in democracy and inspired countless activists to continue the fight for gender equality. Her legacy remains alive in the ongoing struggles for women's rights, serving as a reminder that progress is achieved through persistence and determination. Today, Susan B. Anthony is remembered as a pioneer of women's suffrage and a symbol of the broader fight for equal rights. Her image appears on the U.S. dollar coin, and numerous schools, streets, and institutions bear her name in recognition of her contributions. However, her legacy is more than just a historical memory. It is a call to action for those who continue to work toward justice and equality. Her story demonstrates that one person's unwavering commitment to a cause can create lasting change, influencing not only their own time, but generations to come. In examining the life and work of Susan B. Anthony, we gain insight into the struggles and triumphs of the women's suffrage movement and the broader fight for social justice. Her courage, intelligence, and perseverance serve as an enduring inspiration, proving that no obstacle is insurmountable when driven by the pursuit of justice. The foundation of Susan B. Anthony's lifelong commitment to justice and equality was built in her early years. Born on February 15, 1820, in Adams, Massachusetts, Anthony was raised in a household that valued education, morality, and social reform. Her parents, Daniel and Lucy Anthony, were devout Quakers, a religious group that emphasized simplicity, integrity, and equality. Unlike many families of the time, the Anthonys believed in the equal worth of men and women, a principle that would become central to Susan's later activism. From an early age, she was encouraged to think critically, speak her mind, and challenge injustice, a rare upbringing for a young girl in 19th century America. Susan was the second of 7 children, growing up in an environment where hard work and discipline were essential values. Her father, a successful cotton mill owner, was a strict yet fair man who instilled in his children the importance of self-reliance and perseverance. While many young girls were expected to focus solely on domestic duties, Susan was given the same educational opportunities as her brothers. Her parents believed that women had the right to be educated, an idea that was still considered radical at the time. This emphasis on learning gave Susan a strong intellectual foundation and a belief in the power of knowledge to enact change. One of the most influential figures in Susan's early life was her mother, Lucy Reed Anthony. Although Lucy did not receive a formal education, she was a woman of great intelligence and conviction. She supported social causes such as the abolition of slavery and the temperance movement, which sought to reduce the consumption of alcohol. Lucy's compassion for others and dedication to reform greatly influenced Susan, who would later adopt these causes as her own. The combination of her father's discipline and her mother's activism created a powerful force in young Susan, shaping her into the determined advocate she would become. Another key influence in Susan B. Anthony's upbringing was the Quaker belief in gender equality. Unlike mainstream American society, which placed women in subordinate roles, Quakers believed that men and women were spiritual equals. Women in Quaker communities were allowed to speak publicly, participate in religious meetings, and even take on leadership roles. This early exposure to female empowerment was instrumental in shaping Susan's views on gender equality. It provided her with a framework to question societal norms and advocate for the rights of women, even in the face of intense opposition. Despite the progressive nature of her family and religious community, Susan quickly realized that the broader society did not share the same values. As she grew older, she began to notice the injustices faced by women, including limited educational opportunities, restricted property rights, and an almost total lack of political representation. These realizations planted the seeds of her future activism. Unlike many women of her era who accepted these limitations as inevitable, Susan was determined to challenge them. She believed that women were just as capable as men and that they deserved the same opportunities in education, employment, and political life. Her early experiences with education further reinforced her commitment to gender equality. In the 1830s, formal education for girls was often inadequate, focusing on subjects that were considered appropriate for their future roles as wives and mothers. However, Susan's father established a school in their home to ensure that his daughters received a rigorous education. She later attended a Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia, where she excelled in her studies. This exposure to a more structured academic environment deepened her appreciation for learning and fueled her desire to advocate for educational reform. Unfortunately, Susan's education was cut short when her father experienced financial difficulties, forcing her to leave school and return home. Despite this setback, she remained dedicated to self-education, reading extensively and engaging in intellectual discussions with her family and community. This period of financial struggle also exposed her to the harsh realities of economic inequality, an issue that would later influence her advocacy for fair wages and labor rights. Instead of seeing these challenges as obstacles, Susan used them as motivation to fight for a more just society. By the time she reached adulthood, Susan B. Anthony had developed a strong sense of purpose and a desire to contribute to meaningful social change. She began her career as a teacher, a profession that provided her with first-hand experience of the gender-based discrimination faced by women in the workforce. She quickly realized that female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts, despite performing the same work. This injustice deeply angered her and became one of the first issues she actively sought to change. Although she did not yet consider herself a full-fledged activist, these experiences laid the groundwork for her future involvement in the women's rights movement. Beyond education and labor rights, another major influence on young Susan was the growing abolitionist movement. Her family was deeply involved in the fight against slavery, hosting anti-slavery meetings in their home and supporting the Underground Railroad. This early exposure to the horrors of slavery and the courage of those fighting against it helped shape Susan's broader views on human rights. She saw clear parallels between the oppression of enslaved people and the legal and social subjugation of women. These connections would later inform her activism, as she worked alongside both abolitionists and women's rights advocates to push for sweeping societal reforms. Susan B. Anthony's early life played a crucial role in shaping the leader she would become. Her upbringing in a progressive Quaker household, her exposure to social reform movements, and her firsthand experiences with injustice all contributed to her unwavering commitment to equality. Even as a young woman, she possessed a strong sense of right and wrong, an unshakable belief in justice, and the courage to challenge the status quo. These early influences set the stage for her lifelong fight for women's suffrage and civil rights, ensuring that her legacy would endure for generations to come. Education played a crucial role in shaping Susan B. Anthony's worldview and commitment to social reform. From an early age, she recognized the power of knowledge as a tool for empowerment, particularly for women, who were often denied access to quality education. Growing up in a Quaker household that valued learning, she received an education that was rare for girls at the time. However, her experiences as both a student and a teacher exposed her to the deep inequalities that existed in the American educational system. These experiences strengthened her resolve to fight for equal opportunities for women and contributed significantly to her later activism. During the early 19th century, educational opportunities for women were limited, with most schools offering only basic literacy and domestic training. While boys were prepared for professional careers, girls were often trained to become wives and mothers, receiving instruction in etiquette, sewing, and household management rather than academic subjects. However, Susan B. Anthony's father, Daniel Anthony, strongly opposed these limitations. Believing in intellectual equality between men and women, he ensured that his daughters received an education comparable to that of their brothers. He established a homeschool where Susan and her siblings were taught rigorous academic subjects, including mathematics, science, and philosophy. In her teenage years, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia, which further enriched her intellectual development. This experience reinforced her love for learning and her belief that education should be accessible to all, regardless of gender. However, her time at the boarding school was cut short due to her family's financial difficulties. The Panic of 1837, a severe economic downturn, devastated her father's business, forcing Susan to leave school and contribute financially to the family. Despite this setback, she remained deeply committed to self-education, continuing to read extensively and engage in intellectual discussions. At the age of 17, Susan B. Anthony began her career as a teacher. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions available to women in the 19th century, but it was also one of the most underpaid and undervalued. Women teachers earned significantly less than their male counterparts, regardless of their qualifications or experience. Anthony was quick to recognize this injustice, and it fueled her early activism in advocating for fair wages and improved working conditions for female educators. She firmly believed that equal work deserved equal pay, a principle that would later become central to the broader women's rights movement. During her teaching career, Anthony worked in several schools across New York, experiencing firsthand the disparities in educational opportunities between boys and girls. She noted that while boys were encouraged to develop leadership skills and pursue advanced studies, girls were often relegated to passive roles with limited academic challenges. This inequality deeply troubled her, and she became increasingly vocal about the need for educational reform. She argued that women should have access to the same level of instruction as men, as education was essential for achieving independence and self-sufficiency. In 1846, Anthony accepted a position as the headmistress of the female department at Carnegie Academy in New York. This was a prestigious role for a woman at the time, and it allowed her to implement some of her ideas about educational equality. However, despite her success in the position, she continued to face discrimination. She earned only a fraction of the salary paid to male teachers, despite holding the same responsibilities. This blatant wage disparity further solidified her belief that systemic change was necessary to ensure fair treatment for women in the workforce. Beyond issues of pay and educational quality, Anthony also witnessed the broader challenges that women faced in society. Many of her female students came from families that did not prioritize their education, viewing it as secondary to their future roles as wives and mothers. This realization led Anthony to advocate for greater societal recognition of women's intellectual capabilities. She believed that education was the key to breaking the cycle of female dependence and subjugation. A well-educated woman, she argued, was better equipped to make informed decisions, contribute to society, and demand her rightful place as an equal citizen. Despite her passion for teaching, Anthony eventually grew frustrated with the limitations placed on women in the profession. She longed to make a broader impact and challenge the societal structures that upheld gender inequality. In 1849, after more than a decade in the classroom, she decided to leave teaching to focus on social reform. By this time, she had already become involved in movements for temperance and abolition, and she realized that her true calling lay in activism rather than education. Though she left the teaching profession, her experiences in the field profoundly influenced her future work in advocating for equal rights. Her time as a teacher provided her with valuable skills that she would later use in the women's rights movement. She honed her abilities in public speaking, organization, and persuasion, skills that would prove essential in her future activism. Moreover, her firsthand encounters with gender discrimination gave her a personal understanding of the struggles that women faced in professional settings. These experiences made her an even more passionate advocate for women's suffrage, labor rights, and educational reform. Susan B. Anthony's early career in education played a pivotal role in shaping her activism. Her exposure to the injustices faced by female teachers and students fueled her desire to challenge the status quo and fight for gender equality. She recognized that education was not just a personal privilege, but a fundamental right that could empower women and transform society. Though she ultimately left teaching to pursue activism full-time, the lessons she learned in the classroom remained with her throughout her life. Her advocacy for equal education and fair wages laid the groundwork for her later work in the suffrage movement, reinforcing her belief that knowledge was one of the most powerful tools for achieving justice. Before Susan B. Anthony became widely known for her work in the women's suffrage movement, she was a passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery. The fight against slavery played a crucial role in shaping her views on justice, equality, and human rights. Her involvement in the abolitionist movement not only strengthened her commitment to social reform, but also introduced her to key figures and organizational strategies that would later influence her work in women's rights. Through her activism, Anthony came to see the deep connections between the struggles of enslaved people and the oppression of women, reinforcing her belief that all people deserved full political and social equality. Susan B. Anthony's abolitionist convictions were deeply rooted in her upbringing. Raised in a Quaker household, she was taught from an early age that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God, regardless of race or gender. The Quaker faith had long been associated with anti-slavery efforts, and many Quakers actively participated in abolitionist activities, including operating stops along the Underground Railroad. Anthony's father, Daniel Anthony, was a strong opponent of slavery, and their home frequently hosted abolitionist meetings where leading activists gathered to discuss strategies for ending the institution of slavery in America. These early influences made a lasting impression on Susan and set the stage for her lifelong commitment to justice. During the 1840s and 1850s, Anthony became actively involved in the abolitionist cause, working alongside some of the most prominent figures of the movement. She formed a close friendship with Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who had become one of the most powerful voices against slavery. Their collaboration was built on mutual respect and a shared vision of equality. Douglass, who also supported women's rights, encouraged Anthony's activism, while she, in turn, helped promote his anti-slavery message. Their partnership highlighted the intersectionality of social justice movements, demonstrating that the fight for racial equality and gender equality were deeply interconnected. Anthony also worked with William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, both of whom were leading abolitionists of the time. She became a prominent member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, traveling across the country to deliver speeches and organize events advocating for the immediate end of slavery. Public speaking was a challenging task for women in the 19th century, as societal norms discouraged them from speaking in public, especially on controversial topics. However, Anthony was undeterred. She developed a commanding presence as a speaker, using logic, moral arguments, and powerful rhetoric to persuade audiences. Despite her dedication, Anthony faced significant hostility and resistance. Many people, particularly those in the South, but also in the North, believed that slavery was an economic necessity and that abolitionists were dangerous radicals. During her travels, she was frequently met with opposition, including verbal abuse, threats, and even physical violence. Some of her lectures were disrupted by angry mobs, and at times, she had to rely on law enforcement for protection. However, these challenges only strengthened her resolve. She understood that the fight against oppression would not be won easily, and that persistence was necessary to achieve justice. One of Anthony's key contributions to the abolitionist movement was her ability to organize and mobilize support. She played a significant role in petition drives, collecting thousands of signatures to pressure legislators to end slavery. She also coordinated fundraising efforts to support the work of anti-slavery newspapers, such as The Liberator, and to provide assistance to formerly enslaved individuals seeking freedom and economic independence. Her organizational skills and strategic thinking made her an invaluable asset to the movement, and she quickly became known as one of its most effective advocates. The abolitionist movement was deeply divided over the role of women in leadership positions. Some male abolitionists believed that women should support the cause but not take on public roles. Anthony and her close ally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, strongly opposed this view. They argued that women had the right to be full participants in the movement, just as men did. This dispute led to tensions within the abolitionist community, but it also reinforced Anthony's belief that women needed to have their own independent political voice. Her experiences in the abolitionist movement helped her realize that true equality could not be achieved unless both race and gender discrimination were addressed. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, marked a turning point for the abolitionist movement. With the war centered on the issue of slavery, Anthony and many of her fellow activists intensified their efforts. She supported the Union cause, believing that the defeat of the Confederacy would bring an end to slavery once and for all. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, Anthony saw it as a step in the right direction, but knew that more work was needed. She continued to advocate for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which would permanently abolish slavery in the United States. After the Civil War, Anthony was faced with a difficult dilemma. Many of her fellow abolitionists shifted their focus towards securing voting rights for black men through the 14th and 15th Amendments. While Anthony fully supported black suffrage, she was frustrated that women were once again being left out of the conversation. She and other women's rights activists had hoped that the end of slavery would bring a broader expansion of civil rights for all people, including women. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, granting black men the right to vote but excluding women, Anthony felt betrayed by her former allies in the abolitionist movement. Susan B. Anthony's involvement in the abolitionist movement was instrumental in shaping her approach to activism and social reform. Her work alongside leading abolitionists, her experiences with public advocacy, and her exposure to political organizing all prepared her for the next major battle of her life: the fight for women's suffrage. Though she was deeply disappointed by the exclusion of women from post-Civil War voting rights, she remained steadfast in her commitment to justice. Her time in the abolitionist movement reinforced her belief that equality must be absolute, that no person, regardless of race or gender, should be denied their fundamental rights. This conviction would fuel her relentless pursuit of women's suffrage, ensuring that her legacy would continue to inspire future generations. Before dedicating herself fully to the women's suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony was an active leader in the temperance movement, which sought to reduce or eliminate alcohol consumption in the United States. The temperance movement was one of the most significant social reform efforts of the 19th century, and Anthony saw it as directly connected to the struggle for women's rights. Through her work in this cause, she gained valuable experience in public speaking, organizing, and mobilizing political support, skills that would later prove essential in her fight for women's suffrage. The temperance movement was driven by concerns over the destructive effects of alcohol on families and society. In the mid-19th century, excessive alcohol consumption was a widespread problem, and it often led to domestic violence, financial ruin, and neglect of family responsibilities. Women, in particular, were disproportionately affected by alcoholism, as they had few legal protections against abusive husbands and no control over family finances. Since women had little legal recourse in cases of domestic abuse and were unable to vote on policies that could regulate alcohol consumption, many saw temperance as a crucial step toward improving their lives. Anthony became involved in the temperance movement in the 1850s and quickly emerged as a prominent leader. She joined the Daughters of Temperance, an organization that advocated for laws restricting the sale and consumption of alcohol. However, despite the organization's commitment to reform, Anthony noticed that women were often excluded from leadership positions and decision-making processes. Much like in the abolitionist movement, she saw that women were expected to support the cause, but were rarely given a platform to speak publicly or lead initiatives. This exclusion reinforced her growing belief that women needed greater political power to enact meaningful change. Determined to give women a stronger voice in the movement, Anthony co-founded the Women's State Temperance Society in 1852 alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The organization sought not only to promote temperance but also to empower women to take leadership roles in advocacy. Unlike many temperance groups of the time, which focused primarily on moral persuasion, Anthony and Stanton believed in pursuing legal and legislative solutions. They pushed for laws that would limit alcohol sales and provide women with greater legal protections against alcohol-related domestic abuse. Anthony's involvement in the temperance movement further exposed her to the political and legal barriers that women faced. While advocating for stricter alcohol laws, she encountered resistance from lawmakers who dismissed women's concerns and denied them the right to participate in public discourse. In one particularly telling incident, Anthony was denied the right to speak at a temperance convention in Albany, New York, simply because she was a woman. Outraged by this injustice, she left the convention and vowed to dedicate herself fully to the cause of women's rights. She realized that without political power, women would always struggle to influence the policies that affected their lives. This turning point marked Anthony's transition from a temperance advocate to a full-fledged women's rights activist. While she continued to support temperance efforts, she now saw women's suffrage as the most urgent and necessary reform. If women had the right to vote, they could directly influence policies related to temperance, education, and social welfare. Anthony's experiences in the temperance movement had shown her that true reform was impossible without equal political representation, and she became convinced that securing the vote for women was the key to achieving broader social change. Her work in temperance also taught her valuable skills that would later be instrumental in the suffrage movement. She became a skilled public speaker, delivering powerful and persuasive speeches that inspired audiences across the country. Despite facing hostility and ridicule from those who believed women should remain silent in public affairs, she developed a reputation as a formidable and fearless orator. Additionally, her experience organizing temperance societies helped her build networks of like-minded women who would later join her in the fight for suffrage. One of the most significant lessons Anthony learned from the temperance movement was the importance of strategic activism. She saw firsthand how public petitions, legislative lobbying, and grassroots organizing could influence policy. These strategies would later become central to the women's suffrage movement. By gathering thousands of signatures on petitions, coordinating state and national campaigns, and pressuring lawmakers to act, Anthony helped develop a model for effective political advocacy that would be used for decades to come. Although the temperance movement remained a major social cause throughout Anthony's lifetime, she gradually distanced herself from it as her focus shifted entirely to women's suffrage. She never abandoned her belief in the importance of temperance, but she recognized that without the right to vote, women's voices would never be truly heard. Her work in temperance had laid the foundation for her activism, but it was now clear to her that the ultimate goal was full political and legal equality for women. Susan B. Anthony's involvement in the temperance movement was a crucial step in her journey toward becoming one of the most influential women's rights activists in American history. Through her work in temperance, she gained experience in public speaking, organizing, and political strategy, while also witnessing the systemic discrimination that kept women from fully participating in society. These experiences solidified her belief that women needed the right to vote in order to enact meaningful change. By shifting her focus from temperance to suffrage, Anthony set herself on a path that would define the rest of her life and leave a lasting impact on the fight for equality. Susan B. Anthony's experiences in the abolitionist and temperance movements led her to one inevitable conclusion: women could not achieve real change unless they had the power to vote. Without political representation, women remained at the mercy of laws created by men, often without consideration for their rights or well-being. The injustices she had witnessed, whether it was the denial of women's voices in reform movements, wage discrimination in teaching, or the inability of women to protect themselves from domestic abuse, were all symptoms of a larger problem: women's exclusion from the political process. With this realization, Anthony dedicated the rest of her life to securing the right to vote for women, embarking on what would become one of the most persistent and influential fights for equality in American history. Although Anthony had been interested in women's rights since the early 1850s, it was her partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton that solidified her commitment to the cause. Stanton, a writer and theorist, had played a key role in organizing the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which was the first major gathering focused on women's rights in the United States. While Stanton provided much of the ideological foundation for the movement, Anthony became its most prominent organizer and public speaker. Together, they formed an effective team, complementing each other's strengths and advancing the cause with relentless energy. One of Anthony's first major initiatives was organizing petitions to demand that New York's legislature grant married women control over their wages and property. At the time, married women had little to no legal autonomy. Any wages they earned legally belonged to their husbands, and they had no rights to property. While these petitions did not immediately result in sweeping legal changes, they helped raise awareness about the injustices women faced and introduced Anthony to the process of political lobbying. It became clear to her that real change required not just grassroots activism, but also engagement with lawmakers. Anthony quickly established herself as a powerful advocate for women's suffrage, traveling across the country to deliver speeches and organize meetings. This was no small feat, as public speaking by women was still widely considered inappropriate and even scandalous. She frequently encountered hostility from both men and women, who believed that politics was a man's domain and that women should remain in the private sphere of home and family. Despite this opposition, Anthony refused to be silenced. She believed that if women could not participate in politics, they would remain powerless to change the laws that govern their lives. One of her greatest challenges was convincing other women to join the movement. Many women had been raised to accept their subordinate status and feared the social consequences of demanding political rights. Anthony worked tirelessly to change this mindset, using logic, moral arguments, and real-life examples of injustice to persuade women that suffrage was not just a privilege, but a necessity. She argued that without the right to vote, women would always be subject to laws made by men, with no ability to influence the decisions that affected their lives. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton co-founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, an organization dedicated to securing a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. Unlike other suffrage groups that focused on state-by-state efforts, the NWSA sought to make suffrage a national priority, believing that only a federal amendment could guarantee women's voting rights across the country. The organization also addressed broader issues related to women's rights, including property laws, education, and employment opportunities, recognizing that suffrage was just one part of a larger struggle for equality. One of the defining moments of Anthony's activism came in 1872 when she decided to test the limits of the law by voting in the presidential election. At the time, women were not legally allowed to vote, but Anthony argued that the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law, should be interpreted to include women. She successfully cast her vote in Rochester, New York, but was soon arrested and charged with voting illegally. Her trial, which gained national attention, became a powerful symbol of the suffrage movement. During her trial, Anthony was denied the right to testify in her own defense, and the judge instructed the jury to find her guilty without deliberation. She was fined $100, a fine she proudly refused to pay. Her defiance turned her into a national icon and further fueled the suffrage movement, inspiring women across the country to demand their rights. Though she did not succeed in overturning the law, her bold act of civil disobedience demonstrated the absurdity of denying women the right to vote while expecting them to obey the law and pay taxes. Despite setbacks, Anthony remained undeterred. She continued to travel, lecture, and write about the importance of women's suffrage. Her relentless efforts helped shift public opinion over time, slowly building momentum for the cause. However, she faced constant opposition from politicians, religious leaders, and even some women who feared that granting women the right to vote would disrupt traditional gender roles. Anthony knew that change would not come easily, but she was willing to dedicate her life to the struggle, believing that future generations of women would one day benefit from her efforts. Susan B. Anthony's early efforts in the fight for women's suffrage laid the groundwork for one of the most transformative movements in American history. She recognized that without the right to vote, women would never achieve true equality, and she committed herself fully to securing this fundamental right. Her activism, despite resistance and legal obstacles, inspired a new generation of women to demand their place in democracy. Although she would not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920, her tireless work made it possible. Her legacy remains a testament to the power of perseverance and the enduring fight for justice. Susan B. Anthony's tireless work for women's suffrage faced not only societal resistance, but also significant internal challenges within the women's rights movement itself. Although her advocacy for women's equality was unwavering, she often found herself navigating the delicate politics of alliance building, as well as contending with the divisions and differing ideologies that existed among suffrage organizations. These challenges required her to demonstrate remarkable political acumen and patience, as she balanced the competing interests of different groups while remaining true to her vision of a fully inclusive society. Her ability to form critical alliances with other reformers was key to advancing the cause of women's suffrage, and it reflected her deep understanding of the interconnectedness of social justice movements. One of the most significant hurdles that Anthony faced was gaining acceptance from factions within the suffrage movement itself. The 19th century women's rights movement was not monolithic, and differing views about the goals and strategies for achieving women's suffrage often caused rifts. While many suffragists advocated for a state-by-state approach to securing the vote, Anthony believed that only a national constitutional amendment could guarantee women's suffrage on a wide scale. This difference in strategy created tension within the movement, particularly with more conservative factions. Anthony, however, remained committed to the idea that the federal government had to be pressured into granting women the right to vote, and she consistently pushed for a national amendment. The divide between different suffrage groups also mirrored the broader debate over race and the post-Civil War amendments. The passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, opened deep divisions in the women's suffrage movement. Many suffragists, including Susan B. Anthony, had hoped that the post-war constitutional amendments would also include women. When this did not happen, some of her allies in the abolitionist movement, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, argued vehemently that both black men and women should be granted the right to vote at the same time. However, other women's rights activists believed that the suffrage movement should focus exclusively on women's rights, regardless of race, and that securing black male suffrage first was a necessary step toward achieving the broader goal of equality. The introduction of race into the suffrage debate led to a split within the suffrage movement. Some suffragists, including Stanton and Anthony, chose to support black men's suffrage despite the exclusion of women. Anthony, in particular, was pragmatic in her approach, realizing that securing voting rights for black men would benefit the broader cause of social justice and civil rights. Yet this decision was controversial and led to criticisms from those who believed that the suffrage movement should have remained focused solely on women. Despite the controversy, Anthony believed that racial justice and gender justice were interconnected, and she knew that racial inequality would continue to affect women of color. Thus, she chose to support the ratification of the 15th Amendment, despite the exclusion of women. Anthony's willingness to navigate such complex social and political terrain was a testament to her remarkable political savvy. She was not only a powerful advocate for women's rights, but also a leader who could build bridges between different factions and convince others to join the cause. In the face of these internal struggles, Anthony remained steadfast in her belief that the fight for women's suffrage had to be inclusive and that true equality could not be achieved without addressing both racial and gender disparities. She knew that the ultimate goal was to secure equal rights for all people, regardless of gender, race, or class. One of the critical alliances that Anthony formed during this period was with other prominent suffragists such as Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. While these women did not always agree on the specifics of the suffrage strategy, they shared a commitment to the broader cause of women's rights. Through collaboration with these leaders, Anthony was able to expand the reach of the suffrage movement and bring new perspectives to the table. This alliance allowed her to strengthen her arguments and build a more unified front, despite the ideological differences within the movement. Additionally, Anthony recognized the importance of engaging with men who supported women's suffrage. While many men were opposed to women's participation in politics, there were also some male allies who shared her vision for a more just and egalitarian society. She worked with men like Frederick Douglass, who continued to advocate for women's rights even after securing voting rights for black men. Douglass and Anthony shared a deep mutual respect and worked together to promote the idea that suffrage for women and black people was essential for the nation's future. Their relationship was based on a shared understanding that both racial and gender equality were necessary to uphold the principles of democracy. Another important alliance that Anthony formed was with working-class women, whom she believed would benefit greatly from the right to vote. Anthony recognized that the struggles of working-class women, such as long working hours, low wages, and poor working conditions, were intricately tied to the lack of political representation. She sought to build coalitions with labor activists and reformers who were already working to improve the lives of working-class people. By emphasizing the intersection of gender and class inequality, Anthony helped to broaden the appeal of the suffrage movement and show that women's rights were part of a larger fight for social justice. Despite these successes, Anthony's efforts to build alliances were not always smooth. Her political vision was expansive, and she was willing to take risks and challenge established norms in order to push the suffrage cause forward. She often faced opposition from those within the suffrage movement who were unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths about race, class, and gender. Yet Anthony's ability to form strategic alliances, her unwavering commitment to the broader cause of justice, and her refusal to compromise on her ideals made her a formidable force in the fight for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony's ability to navigate the complex terrain of alliances and internal divisions within the suffrage movement was critical to her success as a leader. Her vision for women's suffrage was rooted in the belief that true equality could only be achieved through a comprehensive approach that included both racial and gender justice. By building alliances with other activists, reformers, and even male allies, she was able to expand the scope and influence of the movement, ensuring that the fight for women's suffrage remained a national priority. Anthony's legacy is one of strategic brilliance, perseverance, and a deep commitment to justice for all. Susan B. Anthony's decades-long fight for women's suffrage was characterized not only by her tireless advocacy and strategic alliances, but also by her persistent efforts to challenge the legal system that systematically denied women their rights. The battle for women's suffrage was a multifaceted struggle, involving legal reform, political resistance, and societal transformation. While Anthony's activism created tremendous public awareness, the legal barriers that prevented women from voting remained formidable obstacles throughout her lifetime. Nevertheless, her dedication to advocating for legal change played a crucial role in shaping the course of the suffrage movement and influencing the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. In the 19th century, women's legal status was deeply entrenched in societal norms that treated them as subordinate to men. Married women, in particular, were subject to the legal doctrine of coverture, which meant that their legal rights were subsumed by their husbands upon marriage. This system denied women control over their own property, earnings, and even their own bodies. For women like Anthony, this was a clear manifestation of the deep-seated gender inequalities that pervaded all aspects of life. From a legal standpoint, women's disenfranchisement was not just a political issue. It was also a reflection of a broader societal belief that women were unfit for the public sphere. Anthony understood that the legal system was a significant barrier to achieving gender equality, and she was determined to dismantle it. One of her first acts of legal defiance was her 1872 arrest for voting in the presidential election, an act that was emblematic of her belief in the Constitution's promise of equal protection under the law. Anthony argued that the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection should apply to women as well as men. Her arrest became a public spectacle, drawing attention to the suffrage cause and exposing the contradictions of a system that claimed to support equal rights but systematically excluded women from full citizenship. Despite the attention her arrest garnered, the legal system did not budge. Anthony was fined $100 for her actions, but she refused to pay the fine, seeing it as an unjust penalty for asserting her rights as a citizen. The case was emblematic of the legal roadblocks suffragists like Anthony faced. Courts consistently upheld the exclusion of women from voting, citing historical precedent and legal interpretations that favored male suffrage. The legal system, which was largely shaped by men, continued to assert that women lacked the capacity for political participation. This resistance to change made Anthony's work even more challenging, but also reinforced her resolve to bring about legal reform. In addition to her direct legal challenges, Anthony worked tirelessly to change the laws through legislative action. Throughout her career, she lobbied for the introduction of women's suffrage bills in state and national legislatures. In the 1860s and 1870s, several suffrage bills were introduced, but none passed. The political climate was not yet ripe for such radical reforms, and many lawmakers were staunchly opposed to granting women the right to vote. Political resistance to suffrage came from various sources, including conservative politicians, religious leaders, and even some women who feared that women's involvement in politics would undermine their traditional roles in the home. One of the most significant challenges Anthony faced in her lobbying efforts was the widespread belief that women's suffrage would lead to social upheaval and the breakdown of gender norms. Opponents of women's rights argued that women's proper place was in the home, and that granting them the vote would disrupt the natural order of society. Political leaders feared that suffrage would lead to greater calls for social and economic reforms, which they believed would benefit the poor and working class, rather than the middle and upper classes that were more invested in maintaining the status quo. These arguments, though rooted in gendered and class-based assumptions, were difficult to counter, especially in an era where traditional gender roles were deeply entrenched. Despite these political barriers, Anthony continued to work on the state and federal levels to pass suffrage laws. One of her most significant contributions during this time was her involvement in organizing the National Woman Suffrage Association's national campaigns, which included lobbying Congress and state legislatures, distributing literature, and organizing public demonstrations. She understood the importance of grassroots activism and mass mobilization in putting pressure on political leaders to act. These efforts were crucial in shifting public opinion on the issue of women's suffrage, even if they did not immediately result in legal change. Throughout the late 19th century, Anthony and other suffragists faced political opposition not only from men in power, but also from conservative women who believed that their social and moral influence was more powerful than the vote. These women, often from elite backgrounds, feared that political participation would undermine their perceived moral authority and disrupt the social order. Some suffragists also disagreed on strategy, with some preferring a state-by-state approach to suffrage, while others, like Anthony, believed in pushing for a national constitutional amendment. This internal division weakened the suffrage movement at times, but Anthony remained committed to her vision of a unified national campaign. Despite the ongoing political opposition, Susan B. Anthony's contributions to the suffrage movement were pivotal in laying the groundwork for future progress. Her legal challenges, such as her arrest for voting, helped shift public perception of the suffrage movement from a fringe cause to a legitimate political issue. By taking a bold stand against the laws that disenfranchised women, she demonstrated the urgency of the issue and forced the nation to confront its contradictions. Additionally, her lobbying efforts and tireless campaigning built a foundation of support that would eventually result in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Though Susan B. Anthony did not live to see the 19th Amendment passed, her legal challenges and political advocacy were crucial in bringing the suffrage movement to the forefront of American politics. Her commitment to legal reform, whether through direct action, lobbying, or public advocacy, was a defining feature of her activism. She understood that the fight for women's suffrage was not just about gaining the vote, but also about reshaping the legal and political structures that upheld gender inequality. Anthony's work set the stage for the eventual success of the suffrage movement, proving that legal reform was an essential part of achieving social justice. The struggle for women's suffrage in the United States was a legal and political battle as much as it was a social and moral one. Susan B. Anthony's efforts to challenge the legal framework that excluded women from political participation were instrumental in raising awareness about the need for reform. Her arrests, public speeches, and relentless lobbying efforts helped expose the inherent contradictions in the legal system and laid the groundwork for the eventual success of the suffrage movement. Anthony's work illustrates the importance of legal reform in the broader struggle for gender equality and highlights the crucial role that political opposition played in shaping the trajectory of the movement. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the women's suffrage movement gained significant traction not only through legal and political means, but also through public advocacy and media engagement. Susan B. Anthony, in particular, understood the transformative power of public opinion in shaping the course of social and political movements. She used her considerable public speaking skills and her understanding of the press to elevate the suffrage cause into the national spotlight. Through speeches, publications, and strategic media outreach, Anthony was able to garner widespread support for women's suffrage, despite the entrenched opposition she faced from political leaders, the media, and social conservatives. Her efforts exemplified the ways in which public advocacy and media played an essential role in advancing the movement, both by influencing public perception and creating a climate conducive to political change. One of the most significant ways in which Anthony influenced public opinion was through her public speeches. As a charismatic speaker, she traveled widely across the United States, delivering lectures that not only addressed the political arguments for women's suffrage, but also emphasized its moral and social dimensions. In these speeches, she connected the right to vote with broader issues of gender equality, including women's rights in the workplace, education, and family life. Anthony's speeches were notable for their clarity and persuasiveness, and they helped to educate the public about the injustices women faced as a result of their disenfranchisement. Her speeches often addressed audiences directly, challenging them to reconsider their assumptions about women's role in society and urging them to recognize women's full citizenship. In addition to her public speaking, Anthony leveraged the media to further amplify her message. She understood that the press could be a powerful tool in shaping public discourse, and she was adept at using newspapers and magazines to promote the suffrage cause. She cultivated relationships with journalists and editors who were sympathetic to the movement and worked tirelessly to ensure that the suffrage movement was covered by the media. She also wrote articles herself, using her own voice to argue for women's right to vote. In fact, Anthony often contributed to publications such as The Revolution, a suffrage newspaper she co-founded with Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1868. Through these media outlets, Anthony was able to spread her ideas to a broader audience and counter the negative portrayals of suffragists that were often featured in the mainstream press. Despite her efforts, Anthony and other suffragists were frequently met with negative media coverage. Many newspapers, particularly those with conservative leanings, dismissed the suffrage movement as radical and misguided. These papers often ridiculed women's rights activists, painting them as unpatriotic or undermining social stability. For instance, some of the press accused suffragists of being anti-family or of trying to disrupt the natural order of gender roles. These criticisms, however, did not deter Anthony. In fact, they strengthened her resolve. She recognized that negative media attention could sometimes spark curiosity and draw more people into the conversation about women's rights. She used her understanding of the press to turn criticism into an opportunity to further her cause. Anthony's media-savvy strategies also included engaging with new forms of media, such as photography. She understood the power of images in shaping public perceptions and made use of photography to promote her image as a committed and steadfast leader in the suffrage movement. Photos of Anthony, especially those that showed her speaking before large audiences or engaged in public demonstrations, helped to humanize the suffrage cause and made her more relatable to the public. She was frequently photographed alongside other suffrage leaders, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt, which helped to underscore the importance of collaboration and solidarity in the fight for women's rights. In addition to leveraging traditional media outlets, Anthony was instrumental in promoting women's suffrage through public events and demonstrations. She recognized the importance of visual spectacle in drawing attention to the cause and used public gatherings as opportunities to showcase the strength and commitment of suffragists. Public marches, conventions, and rallies were organized across the country, with Anthony often taking the lead in these efforts. These events helped to build momentum for the suffrage movement and provided suffragists with a platform to directly engage with the public. By staging these events in prominent public spaces, Anthony and her colleagues ensured that the suffrage message was visible and hard to ignore. One of the most notable public demonstrations that Anthony was involved in was the National Woman Suffrage Association's campaign to present petitions to Congress. During these campaigns, suffragists would collect signatures from citizens advocating for women's right to vote and present these petitions to lawmakers in Washington, D.C. This public act of petitioning not only demonstrated the widespread support for women's suffrage, but also put pressure on Congress to take action. Although Congress did not pass a suffrage amendment during Anthony's lifetime, these campaigns helped to lay the groundwork for future legislative victories by demonstrating the broad-based demand for change. Despite the challenges she faced, Anthony's ability to navigate the media landscape and use it to her advantage was one of her greatest strengths as a leader of the suffrage movement. Her recognition of the importance of public relations and media strategy allowed her to elevate the suffrage cause to a national platform, garnering the support of both ordinary citizens and influential political leaders. Over time, the visibility of the suffrage movement helped to normalize the idea of women's political participation, making it harder for politicians and public figures to ignore the calls for women's rights. Anthony's media efforts also helped to ensure that the suffrage movement was not just a cause for women, but a national issue that had the potential to reshape American society. Anthony's ability to use public advocacy and media to advance the cause of women's suffrage had a profound impact on the movement, but it also came at a personal cost. As a public figure, Anthony was frequently subjected to criticism, ridicule, and personal attacks. She was often portrayed as a man-hater or a radical feminist, and her work was sometimes misrepresented in the media. Despite the personal toll this took, Anthony remained focused on the bigger picture. She knew that the fight for women's suffrage was not about personal recognition, but about securing a fundamental right for half of the population. The suffrage movement, as Anthony often said, was about the principle of equality for all. Susan B. Anthony's use of public advocacy and media in the fight for women's suffrage demonstrated her deep understanding of the importance of public opinion in shaping political change. Her ability to navigate the media landscape and use it to amplify the suffrage message was a critical factor in the movement's success. Anthony's public speaking, media contributions, and involvement in public demonstrations helped to bring the issue of women's suffrage into the national conversation and turn it into a matter of widespread public concern. While the media landscape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was often hostile to the suffrage movement, Anthony's determination and strategic use of the press played a crucial role in making the case for women's right to vote. Her efforts in public advocacy helped to create a climate in which political change was possible and laid the foundation for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. The final chapter of Susan B. Anthony's remarkable life and work is marked by both triumph and tragedy. Although she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote, her contributions were fundamental to the success of the suffrage movement. Her tireless efforts, strategic alliances, legal challenges, and use of public advocacy played a pivotal role in shifting public opinion and creating the momentum necessary for the eventual victory. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, was the culmination of decades of struggle, and Susan B. Anthony's legacy remains inextricably linked to this monumental achievement. Anthony's life was defined by her unwavering belief in the principles of equality and justice. She dedicated herself to the cause of women's rights and, more broadly, to social reform. Over the years, she built a network of suffrage advocates, mobilized public support, and influenced political leaders, all in the hope of securing women's right to vote. Despite the many obstacles she faced, including legal resistance, political opposition, and societal prejudices, she remained a steadfast champion of the idea that women were entitled to the same rights as men under the law. Her efforts set the stage for a broader social transformation, one that eventually extended beyond suffrage to issues such as workplace equality, reproductive rights, and political representation. While Anthony's name is synonymous with the suffrage movement, it is important to recognize that the victory of the 19th Amendment was not solely her achievement. It was the result of decades of work by numerous suffragists, some of whom, like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, were instrumental in the final push for women's enfranchisement. The suffrage movement evolved over time, incorporating different strategies, ideologies, and goals. Anthony's early insistence on a constitutional amendment was, in many ways, the foundation upon which later generations of suffragists built their campaigns. By the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, the movement had gained critical mass and was able to sway public opinion, but Anthony's contributions were central to this evolution. In particular, Anthony's ability to shape public discourse around the issue of women's suffrage was one of her most significant achievements. Through her tireless work as a public speaker, writer, and media strategist, she brought the issue of women's voting rights to the forefront of national conversations. She understood that the battle for suffrage was not just a political issue, but a moral one, an issue of justice, equality, and human rights. In the face of media ridicule, political opposition, and entrenched gender norms, Anthony persisted in her efforts to change the narrative surrounding women's place in society. Her ability to build public support for the suffrage movement, even when it seemed like a distant and impossible goal, was a key factor in the eventual success of the 19th Amendment. However, the struggle for women's rights did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Although the amendment granted women the right to vote, it did not address many other issues of gender inequality, such as unequal pay, workplace discrimination, or lack of access to education and health care. Furthermore, the 19th Amendment did not fully account for the disenfranchisement of black women, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow laws and discriminatory practices continued to prevent many black women from exercising their right to vote. Anthony's work laid the foundation for future generations of activists to continue the fight for gender equality, but it was clear that the work of suffragists would remain unfinished until the broader social, economic, and racial issues were addressed. Susan B. Anthony's legacy is also closely tied to the broader women's rights movement that emerged in the 20th century. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, the fight for women's rights shifted to issues of economic equality, reproductive rights, and gender-based violence. Anthony's early activism helped to create a cultural climate that was more conducive to these later struggles. The National Organization for Women, NOW, founded in 1966, and other feminist organizations that emerged in the post-suffrage era built upon the groundwork that Anthony and other suffragists laid. While Anthony's activism was focused primarily on voting rights, her broader commitment to gender equality influenced generations of women's rights activists who tackled the systemic issues that continued to affect women. In reflecting on Anthony's legacy, it is essential to recognize the extent to which her work broke barriers and challenged the established social order. In a time when women were expected to focus on domestic duties and remain passive in political and public life, Anthony defied societal norms by asserting her right to engage in the political process. She worked within the system to push for change, but she also demonstrated an incredible willingness to challenge authority and take risks for the cause she believed in. Her bravery in confronting the legal and political structures that denied women their rights was a powerful example of resistance that inspired future generations of activists. Furthermore, Anthony's legacy is marked by her ability to inspire and organize others. She understood that social change required collective action, and she worked tirelessly to build alliances and networks of supporters who shared her vision for a more just and equitable society. Whether through organizing conventions, writing for suffrage publications, or rallying support for legislative change, Anthony played a central role in mobilizing women and men across the country to join the fight for suffrage. Her leadership, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to justice helped to transform the suffrage movement from a marginalized cause into a major political force. Anthony's life was also a testament to the importance of intersectionality in social movements. While her primary focus was on securing voting rights for women, she was also an advocate for the abolition of slavery, civil rights, and labor rights. She understood that gender equality could not be achieved in isolation from the other struggles for social justice. By framing her activism within a broader context of equality for all people, she laid the groundwork for future feminist movements that recognized the need to address the interconnected issues of race, class, and gender in the fight for social change. Despite the many obstacles she faced, Anthony's ability to remain focused on her goal, securing women's full citizenship through suffrage, was a hallmark of her leadership. She understood that the path to justice was long and difficult, but she never wavered in her commitment to achieving equality for women. In doing so, she helped to inspire countless other activists who would continue the fight for women's rights long after her death. The 19th Amendment was a testament to her efforts, but it was also a reminder of the ongoing struggle for full equality and the need to continue challenging the social, legal, and political structures that perpetuate gender-based discrimination. In conclusion, Susan B. Anthony's life and work stand as a monumental testament to the power of individual activism in the face of overwhelming opposition. Her unwavering commitment to the cause of women's suffrage, her ability to navigate political and legal barriers, and her strategic use of public advocacy and media helped to shape the trajectory of the suffrage movement. Although she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, her legacy was integral to its eventual success. Anthony's work laid the foundation for future generations of women's rights activists, and her example of perseverance, leadership, and advocacy continues to inspire movements for social justice today.